afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Phi Alpha Delta Minnesota Statewide Alumni Chapter's CLE seminar entitled Keeping It Real, the Trauma-Informed Attorney. We have applied for one elimination of bias credit for Minnesota, and I will post the CLE code in the chat as well as email it to all attendees. I'll also be posting the slides and other materials for today in the chat. So we are happy to welcome Bob Schuneman today from Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. He is their outreach coordinator. He went to Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and in addition to his JD, he holds an MBA from the University of St. Thomas. Before becoming a lawyer, Bob was a business executive for many years. He taught courses at the graduate and undergraduate level in the Twin Cities for 19 years. And before joining LCL, he practiced law as a solo attorney in Woodbury, Minnesota, representing businesses and individuals. So I'm going to let you take it away, Bob, but feel free to post questions throughout, and hopefully this will be an informative and helpful seminar for you all. Go ahead, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Corey. You know, with that introduction, it makes me sound really old. Hopefully I don't look the part. Anyways, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today. I'm not only everything that Corey said, I'm also a PhD member, and I joined in law school, and I'm just very delighted to be here with you today. So today we're going to talk about the trauma-informed legal professional. And one of the things that we want to come away from this program with is an understanding that trauma is not just something that one person experiences. It kind of changes their outlook on life and changes their approach to life, changes their behavior in many ways. And people who are impacted by trauma are our clients. They can be our jurors. They can be the opposing party, the opposing counsel. They can even be the judge. So understanding trauma and how it affects people can be important to the practice of law, no matter what area of law you happen to practice in. And we're not immune. Legal professionals are also at risk. And as we educate ourselves about the phenomenon of trauma and what it looks like, what the effects of it are, we can help ourselves and help each other. So when we talk about trauma, what is it we're talking about? Well, trauma is a unique individual experience of something that happens. And when we think about something being a unique individual experience, one of the things that I'd like you to remember is that two people can experience the exact same event or set of circumstances. One could be traumatized by it and the other not. I like to compare it to some of the odd weather catastrophes that we see, where we'll see the TV cameras roll into town after a hurricane swept through, and on Main Street or some other street, the west side of the street will be decimated, and the east side of the street looks like it's just another beautiful day in Kansas. And all that separates them, is the width of the street. They experienced the same storm. The effect the storm had on them was different, and that's kind of how trauma or traumatic events. I don't even like to refer to them as a traumatic event. I prefer to refer to them as a potentially traumatic event, because trauma itself is an individual experience. And when it happens, when we experience trauma, what happens is that our ability to integrate the experience is overwhelmed. Okay. And what that looks and feels like is that we end up with, one of the functions of our brain, and especially at night, is our brain is integrating memories that happen during the day and building this timeline of our life. Well, when we've experienced trauma, our brain can't figure out how to place that experience in time and place for us in that timeline of our life. So it's just left hanging. And because it's left hanging in this unresolved state, every time the brain remembers that part or revisits that experience, it's like it's happening right now. It's like it's happening all over again. And our brains confuse the experience with what's happening right now. And there are different types. There's direct trauma, and that's the person that was in the car accident. They were in the car accident, boom, they're directly experiencing the potentially traumatic event. An indirect experience of that potentially traumatic event would be the witness to the car accident. They weren't physically involved in the car, in either car. However, they saw what happened and the scene what happened. Even though they're a bystander, they're indirectly impacted, or they're potentially indirectly impacted by this potentially traumatic event. And just as a general reminder that we're still in this 2+ year long pandemic, and it continues to be potentially traumatic for everyone. And because trauma is a unique individual response, we might have colleagues or clients or anybody, children even, who are being traumatized by something that we think is just another aspect of the new normal. And there's that old saying, don't judge a person until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And that touches on trauma as well. It's important for us to recognize that even if an individual does not meet a diagnostic criteria for trauma-related disorders, what the psychologists and the psychiatrists have, and the medical profession have said, well, as long as you pass this threshold, then we can bill your insurance company for it. But before you pass that threshold, we don't have a diagnostic code for it, so your insurance company won't pay for it. Doesn't matter if an individual meets that diagnostic criteria or not. Trauma can still be affecting his or her life in significant ways. Some people who have experienced traumatic events don't have it, we don't know if they've met the diagnostic criteria because they've never sought help for it. So it's important for us as attorneys to understand that there's not a balancing test. There's not a 4-factor analysis of whether or not somebody's been impacted by trauma, because trauma is in and of itself a subjective experience. Corey, I see a bunch of stuff in the chat. Are there questions, or are those just you placing files in?
I'm just posting the files individually in case anyone had trouble with the zip file, but
okay, thank you.
Keep going. Yep.
Thank you. So in addition to direct and indirect trauma, there's also secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. These impact the lawyer and the legal professional and the legal support staff and the judges and so on. These can impact us personally, even though we weren't in the car accident, and we weren't on the sidewalk, the bystander watching the car accident. As lawyers and legal professionals, we work in a helping profession. We don't always think of ourselves that way, but we help people solve their problems. We help people keep the machinery of society moving. That's what we do. And because we work in a helping profession and we have continued frequent or close contact with the people who have experienced direct trauma or indirect trauma, we have as our clients people who have experienced trauma, whether it's a car accident that we're using, or in family law, for example, people who have been victims of domestic abuse or have experienced long periods of poverty, things like that. But those those are potentially traumatic in and of themselves. And as we deal with those people, as we interact with those people, and we come to care about people, and we empathize with their situation. Every time somebody comes into your office and sits down and tells their story, shares their story with you, you're impacted emotionally. Unless you're a psychopath, you're going to feel some degree of empathy for them. And psychologists and psychiatrists will tell us that psychopaths literally are the only people who have no sense of empathy and cannot empathize with the experience of another person. When we empathize with someone, when we empathize with our clients, we are experiencing some of their emotional state. When that happens on a continued, frequent, or regular basis with somebody who has experienced direct trauma, that can build up in us, and we begin to experience what's known as secondary trauma. Oftentimes I'll ask people, hey, especially in Minnesota here, what's the weight of a single snowflake? Well, it's hardly anything. You can go out in the snow and you get a couple of, you go walk into your car, you get a couple of flakes on your arm, you brush them off. It's no problem at all. The thing with snowflakes, when there's just a few of them, you can brush them off pretty quickly and it doesn't impact your day. But when they accumulate very quickly during a short period of time, and sometimes, they're light and fluffy, and sometimes they're heavy and wet, when they accumulate quickly in a short period of time, then even the mightiest bough on the tallest tree can bend and sometimes break. Trauma can be like that. When we're talking about secondary trauma, when our clients come in and they share their stories with us, and we empathize with them, and we experience a little bit of their emotional state, that can be, it happens once or twice, yeah, we get over it, we work through it, doesn't seem to impact us. But when it happens over time, it can build up. And if we're not doing anything in the way of self-care or personal therapy or anything else, if we're not doing anything like that to mitigate the effect that secondary trauma may have on us, then we, like that mightiest bough on the tallest tree, we can bend and sometimes we break. Vicarious trauma is related. It's a related concept to secondary trauma. Oftentimes we'll see vicarious trauma among legal support staff or jurors and judges, appellate panel members. We see this happening. The salient distinction between secondary trauma and vicarious trauma is that vicarious trauma does not have that continued, frequent, or close contact with people, with the people who have experienced the direct trauma. So if they don't have, a lot of client contact, but they're still working with the reports and the photographs and the witness testimony and all of the other descriptions, especially the photos of horrific events. And now we have recordings with sound. And we've had recordings with sound for a while. So it's not like I'm that old that I don't remember, when we had, when everything was silent films. But the ubiquity of iPhone recordings and cell phone recordings have really brought some of the horror of specific events to us and made us almost as though we are experiencing that indirect trauma, because it's almost as though we are witnessing the actual event in real time, even though we're not. So that secondary and the vicarious trauma, they're like kissing cousins for trauma. And both of these have a lot of play within the legal profession. Now, I mentioned empathy a little bit. Well, as we exercise empathy, as we are exposed to people, and as we share in their emotional state in a small way, a shadow of their emotional state, as we share in that, we can get to a point where we just can't anymore. We become emotionally exhausted. That state of being emotionally exhausted and feeling emotionally overwhelmed by being called upon to empathize more and more, That same sense of being emotionally overwhelmed is an echo of trauma, the emotional overwhelming state that we experience when we're traumatized. And that is secondary trauma. That feeling that we just can't listen to and be present with another person as they share their story of surviving domestic violence. That feeling that we just can't. If we put our heart out there anymore, we'll just be consumed by it, by the sadness or the terror of it, or the seeming hopelessness of it. That feeling of empathy, distress, fatigue, where we just can't anymore. That's a very visceral response that many of us have held. And that is an indicia of secondary trauma. And it's complicated by the way lawyers are trained. We're trained to not show weakness. You show any weakness, and it may be interpreted as a weakness in your case, or something for opposing counsel to attack you on. So we don't show weakness, and we deny, defend, and deflect vulnerability. We're trained, encouraged to approach our cases in a way that's emotionally detached. Well, we can't emotionally detach. We can act as though we're emotionally detached, but we're never truly emotionally detached, unless again we're psychopaths. Then, and you might be aware of some lawyers that you think are psychopaths, but they're probably not. The idea here is that our training leads us down the path towards the experience of secondary and vicarious trauma, unless we're doing something proactive in our lives every day, which I refer to as self-care. Unless we're doing something in the way of self-care every day, we are, by virtue of being attorneys, working in our chosen profession, one of the professional susceptibilities we have is to secondary trauma. And this is partly why, because we train ourselves to be emotionally detached. Police officers have the same issue, that they train themselves to try and be emotionally detached while they perform their job. Triggers. I'm a person in long-term recovery, so I speak about triggers from a first-person perspective, but we've all experienced triggers. You ever walk into a building and smell fresh baked cookies and think of your grandmother? Just the smell of the cookies made you remember grandma, or the smell of a certain perfume will remind you of your mother, or an older sister, or a relative. Those triggers, those are examples of triggers. Well, the thing is, triggers are not always to positive memories. A lot of times they can be to negative memories. Triggers are, I like to describe them as a constellation of stimuli. It can be sound, sight, it can be the combination of things. Anything, we have 5 external senses, any one of them by itself or in combination with the other ones can serve as that constellation that guides our consciousness to re-experience a memory. Well, when that memory that we are re-experiencing is of a traumatic event, remember that traumatic event is unorganized in our head. It hasn't been processed. And because it hasn't been processed, we're still we get transported back to the original trauma. Remember, one of the salient characteristics of a traumatic event is that as we're drawn back into it, our brain cannot cannot identify it as having happened in the past. It thinks it's happening again right now, which can be incredibly confusing, because we're standing in a room talking with a colleague, or we're standing in court trying to address the court, and suddenly we feel as though we're at that intersection where the car accident is happening. And it's disorienting because the memory is not integrated, and we can't tell the difference between past and present. It's very disorienting, and triggers have that power to do that for us. And the thing is, when we're put back in that situation, it's not the case that every time we re-experience it, it gets a little better. It diminishes a little bit. That's not the case at all. It's like like a well-worn path across a field. The more we walk across it, the deeper that rut gets. And we end up with a memory groove that as soon as we're triggered, we're in that. And it gets harder and harder to escape from that, from the memory. Ultimately, trauma can be an ethics issue. Corey, is there a question?
Yeah, so a question came up about detachment, whether we train ourselves to detach or whether it's an external training, such as in the case of police officers. Is that a good thing for lawyers? To what extent should we detach ourselves to protect ourselves from a vicarious trauma while still remaining empathetic to our clients?
I think to the degree that we are encouraged to be emotionally detached, it's not so much to protect ourselves as it is to remain objective about the facts and to focus on the facts and on the legal arguments and leave the emotions off to the side, because we don't care. Consider no fault divorces, for example. We don't care what brought the couple here. We're interested in how we're splitting things up. We don't care about who's at fault. The people divorcing definitely do. They want to argue about that all day long. The court isn't interested in that. We want to focus just on what the court can look at. So when I talk about being emotionally detached and being trained to be emotionally detached, I don't think it's that we receive that training to be as protecting ourselves or insulating ourselves from the danger of vicarious trauma. I think it's so that we can put forth the appearance of objectivity, the appearance of justice served dispassionately, and without emotionally favoring one side or the other. We get steeped in that culture that we need to deliver justice dispassionately, and yes, we advocate for our clients zealously and passionately, but it's a different kind of passion. It's almost an emotionless passion, and if you can conceive of such a thing. And I hope I'm making the distinction. It's very clear in my head, and I hope I'm clarifying it for everybody else. That and in the case of police officers, we want our police officers, when they respond to a situation, we want them to be thinking rationally and acting in rational, logical ways, free of emotion and bias. We want that. So we try and train that into our first responders. And we talk about poise under pressure being a value for first responders, whether they're police officers or EMTs or ER personnel and lawyers. We want to be able to portray calm reservation among, in very difficult and trying situations. Hopefully that answers the question. Ultimately, it's an ethics issue. Everybody here has read the slide while I was talking about emotional detachment. The important point here is that once we start to act in our own interest, whether we feel traumatized by the facts of the, or triggered, I should say, we feel triggered by the facts of a case. So we begin to avoid the case. Once we begin to avoid doing what we're supposed to be doing because of a fact pattern or a situation that is reminiscent of something that happened in our past, where we begin to feel triggered. Once we begin to act in our own self-interest, we are by definition no longer acting in our client's interest. And that avoidance behavior can lead to issues of competence. We're avoiding responding to client inquiries or opposing counsel, or avoiding doing what we're supposed to be doing to keep the case moving. We're not being diligent. It calls into question our competence, and it also calls into possibility additional supervisory actions that might need to be taken. There's an estimate of somewhere between 25 and 30% of active OLPR cases, discipline cases, or cases for public discipline nationwide. The ABA pointed out in their 2021 report on the state of the legal profession that 25 to 30% of active cases for public discipline involve some degree of substance use or mental illness stemming from an underlying trauma. So when we started talking about trauma, what do you think about these events, these situations? Many people think of what's on the list here, and all of these are, without a doubt, potentially traumatic instances or situations. But how about some of these? When we talk about situations or a series of events, prostitution is certainly something that can be potentially traumatic for the people who have been forced into that. Torture, it's clearly something that is potentially traumatic. Homelessness. We don't always think about homelessness or poverty as being potentially traumatic, but they are. Being removed from the home, being involved with a cult, involuntary hospitalization or civil commitment. Many of these things can be potentially traumatic. And when a trauma occurs, not because of a single event, but because of repetitive, prolonged, or cumulative, it's referred to as complex trauma. And complex trauma, we oftentimes see coming as a result of things that have happened in childhood, which leads into developmental trauma. And this is something that lawyers may see more often in their clients than than necessarily among our colleagues. Developmental trauma among our clients is it can be a very serious thing, particularly if we're working in certain areas like family law, where there are a lot of issues that bubble up. And you can see here some of the issues that are consequences of developmental trauma. Child is exhibiting impaired normative development. So they're not progressing according to expectations for either physically, because yes, it can impact physical growth, or emotionally or cognitively. They're not progressing as expected. They have difficulty with behaving in a way that's expected within a group. That is, they might be acting out, and they can have unnatural or anger responses that, I shouldn't say unnatural, but anger responses that are out of proportion to stimuli. And a lot of what we understand about developmental trauma comes out of what's referred to as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or the ACE study. This was first published in 1998 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. It's been replicated numerous times internationally, and the data has been validated, and it's been it continues to inform a lot of our understanding around complex trauma, and not only complex trauma in general, but also how these incidences in our childhood inform and guide and shape our behavior and our adult experiences. There were 3 categories, 10 areas total. It's a very short questionnaire, and I've actually provided a copy of the ACE questionnaire in the materials, so you can look at it and take it yourself. I believe there's instructions on scoring it as well. It's really easy to score. It's essentially you just count them. It looks at 3 areas: abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, emotional or physical neglect, and household dysfunction, including mother treated violently, household substance use, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and incarcerated household members. And the more ACE events a child has during their life, the more susceptible they are to things like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, and impulse control disorders. When you look at the color codes here, for those who had just a single ACE event, adverse childhood event, that's kind of the I don't know if that's red or orangey red, whatever you want to call it. You're at increased susceptibility over somebody that has no adverse childhood events across mood disorders, anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, and impulse control disorders. And it gets significantly worse from there. That tall blue one, that's just 4 adverse childhood events, and suddenly you're at a 70% prevalence rate for anxiety disorders, and pushing 50% for substance use disorders, and over 50% for impulse control orders and mood disorders. These are significant events in a person's life, and it's not just mental health that it adversely impacts. We see across ischemic heart disease, strokes, COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, diabetes, sexually transmitted diseases. The more adverse childhood experiences or events that you have or a person has in their childhood before they reach the age of 18, significantly impacts their health, their physical health, long-term as adults. And these are our clients. These are our jurors. And yeah, these are our colleagues. The John Bowlby is the author of The Origin of Attachment Theory, one of the seminal works on attachment theory within psychology. 2 or more adverse experiences interact so that the risk of a psychological disturbance following is multiplied many times over. What happens to us as children, whether we remember it or not, echoes in our behavior and our choices as adults. Trauma affects us in many ways, cognitively, emotionally, socially. It affects us in many ways. I'm not going to go through each of these points, but I want to help you understand that trauma encompasses a wide range of consequences for us. as human beings, not for us as lawyers, for us as human beings. And this is our clients, our colleagues, our jurors, our judges. These are anybody alive on the planet. When trauma touches a person, these are how some of the effects that they can experience. One of the ones that is most common is dreams. As at night when our brains, hippocampus is working to integrate everything that happened that day on the timeline of our life, and it bumps into that unintegrated memory again, and it tries to work through it. We dream about it, and that in some ways we're re-experiencing the trauma at night in our sleep. Trauma can affect us by adversely impacting our concentration, our memory, our ability to pay attention. We become forgetful, indecisive, spacing out. Now, consider for a moment that you're an attorney. It might be a stretch, but think of yourself as a lawyer. How well can you do your job if you're having issues with concentration, memory, attention, forgetfulness, and being indecisive, and just kind of spacing out? It makes it really hard to do our work. And we begin to try to avoid reminders of the case because getting triggered and put back in that disorienting re-experiencing of the traumatic event, it isn't a pleasant experience. And we have an animal instinct to avoid unpleasant experiences. We don't like pain. We don't like to experience pain, especially when it's associated with the feeling that we can't do anything about it, and we not only can't do anything about it, but we're completely out of control, and we don't understand why we're experiencing what we're experiencing. It also affects us emotionally. We can become emotionally numb, insensitive, indifferent to the suffering of others. We can become humorless, and we oftentimes experience what's referred to as hypervigilance, and we become jumpy. This is one that I'm kind of known for around the office, is that people have to let me know that they're coming to my office door. They have to announce when they're a few steps away, because if I don't realize they're coming and they suddenly appear at the door and call my name, I jump. I startle, and my startle reflex is it's very pronounced, and that sense of hypervigilance is a result of some trauma that I personally have experienced in my life. And we can also have strong and disturbing feelings. We can suddenly just feel anxious or overwhelmingly sad. And untreated trauma can feed into other mental health conditions like depression, suicidality. Trauma also affects us physically. We can become listless, just kind of have no energy. We can't sleep. We have difficulty getting to and staying asleep. We wake up more tired than we were when we went to bed. And we begin to increase self-medicating behavior, whether it's smoking, drinking, drugs, or other risky behaviors. It's no coincidence that the incidence rates of people with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences and STDs are so much higher because of the risky behavior. And oftentimes physically, we'll complain of headaches and digestive distress and more frequent illness. There's a reason for all of those that if we wanted to discuss the physiology of trauma, we could go into its effect on digestion and the immune system, but we'll leave that for another day. Trauma can also affect us socially. And when I say us, again, I'm talking about human beings, not just lawyers. So it could be your client that is being impacted this way, or a colleague, a lack of interest and withdrawal from social activities and interests. If you've attended any of my other CLEs, you've probably heard me say that isolation is a cause and a consequence of substance use disorder, as well as some mental health diagnoses. And trauma encourages us to withdraw from social activities and interests. It makes us more isolated. We can become overprotective of family and professional subordinates, either through isolation or through action. We can, and that overprotectiveness can really be a turnoff for our family members. Teenagers just kind of roll their eyes at their parents when they become overprotective, and that, and they have good reason to. But when we're experiencing trauma, we can become even more overprotective, and that can damage our personal relationships. There are certain behavioral implications, things that happen, that changes in our behavior or our capabilities as a result of trauma. All of these have been mentioned or hinted at in the previous slides. Hypervigilance, flashbacks are things that we oftentimes have already associated with trauma. Difficulty with judgment and cognitive processes. Again, if you're a lawyer and you're experiencing difficulty with judgment and cognitive processes and memory impairments, you've got issues. And a very worrying implication of trauma is that we experience difficulty in distinguishing whether something is safe or dangerous to do. Part of that is expressed in risky behavior, and part of it is expressed in changes in our risk tolerance. And whether we choose to drive drunk or not might, that reflect it, that is a function of our risk tolerance. And changes to our risk tolerance that are driven by trauma or other things related to trauma can be potentially problematic and sometimes disastrous. Dissociation is something that it's a rare experience, but it's a feeling that you become a witness to, kind of a bystander in your own life, where you are watching yourself do something. And that dissociative event, it's a psychological description of an episode. A dissociative episode is surreal, where you are literally doing something, but you feel divorced from your body doing it. Almost as though someone has control of your body and is doing it, and you are powerless to stop it. That happens. It's a real occurrence, a real event, and it's scary. Physical consequences of unresolved trauma increase susceptibility or chances of all of these things. The one that honestly tends to get most people's attention is the last one, because for some reason or other that hits people where they live. I don't know. The heart disease, the hypertension, elevated resting heart rate, all of these things combined lead to a shortened life. So let's revisit that notion of triggers again. Remember, it's any stimulus or set of stimuli that sets off that memory, that unresolved memory. And it has a cumulative effect. And you may not know what the traumatic event was. You might not remember that. Your brain might be protecting you from the memory of it. So that adds to the disorientation and the confusion, because you're suddenly in this emotional state that you don't understand why and what is going on. So towards more effective trauma-informed attorney-client relationships, one of the things that we can do for our clients and parties who may or may not be affected by trauma is increase our focus on safety. People who have been traumatized or experienced a traumatic event, safety is huge for for us. Sometimes it is the most important consideration in a relationship, in a new relationship, certainly in decisions that we make about where we live, where we work. It's the focus on safety. Because people who have experienced trauma may not feel safe. You know, if it was a car accident, they might get real skittish about riding in a car. And that's just a one-time event. That's a car accident. And they're worried about, you know, they're very anxious about automobile safety from that point on. But when it's something that is, you know, more complex, like domestic violence, for example, that changes the way a person looks at safety for the rest of their lives. And what we can do as attorneys to improve our client engagement is to promote a feeling of safety within our initial interview. Almost approaching initial client interviews with the expectation that safety is going to be an issue. Because a lot of times when lawyers meet their clients for the first time, their clients aren't having a great time. You know, they're not having a good day. Under the best of circumstances, they don't want to be there. So doing things to promote safety can be very rewarding and result in a better attorney-client relationship. Some of the things that I talk about I do a presentation on social media and modern technology. And some of the recommendations I give in that is to be present with the person who's present with you. Turn your monitor off, put your cell phone in a desk drawer, you know, on mute. So even if it goes off, you can't hear it. You don't want it vibrating in your desk drawer either, because that's a distraction too. But do what you can to signal to the client that not only is this a safe place, but they have your attention and you are listening, actively listening to them. And as you're discussing the case and their experience, it's very important that you manage expectations, their expectations from the start. You know, that they understand what your role is, that you're an attorney, you're not a counselor. And a lot of times we hear from lawyers that tell us that my client thinks that I'm a counselor, and they don't seem to understand that that's not what I do, and that they're paying me a ridiculous amount of money to listen to them when really that's not what I do. And to make clear that expectation will help inform the attorney-client relationship. A lot of these things are basic, you know, basic client engagement, and honestly, they're basic customer service. Sometimes, you know, I mentioned earlier that we forget that we're in a helping profession. Well, and sometimes I think we forget that we're in a service profession too. And you know, our jobs exist to serve our clients and to help them. It helps if we're culturally competent and that we're aware and we're listening for potential triggers that, particularly in certain areas like family law, criminal law, trauma is going to come up a lot more frequently than it does in patent law. Not that it never occurs in patent law, but it's the frequency or the incidence rate that we would see in family law and criminal law is much higher. And if we can approach the new client interview with patience and a sense of humility, that, you know, our client is there and they're telling us something that we don't know, and they're, in some instances, they are laying bare their emotional state. And that we should tread lightly, because that's not an easy thing for people to do. And if we can, the more we can respond to people with humanity and humility, the better off they'll be, the better off we'll be with respect to the quality of the attorney and client relationship. So how do we build trust? Well, we need to recognize that trust is not instantaneous. A lot of times when people are presenting themselves in our offices, there's some damage that they've experienced, whether physical or emotional or psychological. They're hurting in some way, shape, or form, and trust, just like safety, may be something that takes some time to build. And how we can help build that trust is to express genuine care and concern, to be transparent about the process, and the nuts and bolts of this is how billing works. These are the basic things that the rules of professional conduct require of us, but oftentimes we just kind of gloss over. And the more predictable we can be with our clients, and this predictability is a function of managing expectations, and predictability and consistency of our own behavior with respect to how we're interacting with our clients, how we're communicating with our clients, how we understand and adapt our approach. For example, some clients who have experienced trauma, they might not be able to do a list that, if I give them a list of a dozen things that they have to do, they might not be able to do any of them. But if I give them a list of 3, they can do 3. Or they can answer 3 interrogatories, but they can't do the whole thing. So, figuring out and adapting our approach to meet their capabilities. And I know that's very easy for me to say. It's a lot easier said than done. But the greater the degree to which we can do that, the better our relationship will be, and the more trust we will engender within them. And legal professionals are already at risk. I've hinted at this. When we always ask, is there a case that haunts you, that gets relitigated every night in your dreams? Then there might be some aspect of that case that either is triggering you, or the fact pattern is, trauma has traumatized you. You might be suffering from secondary trauma as a result of it. Tools to lessen trauma's impact is, first off, be aware of what trauma looks like, and how it can affect us. Strive for a balance in your life. A work-life balance is talked about a lot. Human connection, maintaining human connections is incredibly important. One of the articles that is in the materials I shared is a reprint of an article from the Wisconsin Bar Journal about a study that was done among Wisconsin public defenders. And one of the conclusions of that study, one of the findings, was that one of the best ways to protect ourselves from the ravages of secondary trauma is to informally get together with people who do the same job we do, and talk about work. And how this works. You get together with people, and sometimes we complain about work, but we might describe a case in generalities. And the thing is, we're talking with people who get it, who understand what we're going through in working cases of this type. And the camaraderie and the human connection that comes about because of that helps us to lessen the impact of trauma in our life. And self-care, I mentioned earlier, taking care of ourselves each and every day means not isolating, recognizing when we're triggered and asking the next question. I'm suddenly feeling anxious. Why? What is it about what's going on right now that is triggering me? Maybe it might help us to peel back the another layer of the onion and figure out how we tick. Get help. If you're feeling triggered and you don't know why, call LCL. We'll get you in touch with a counselor. Okay. And there is a thing called trauma-focused treatment that can be very helpful. Treating trauma is not a 2 or 3 session thing. This is time intensive, and it takes the assistance of somebody who is trained in treating trauma, but it's definitely something that is important to do. We're also going to talk briefly about resilience, because resilience helps us and I love the definition here from the Army. Resilience is the ability to persist in the face of challenges and to bounce back from adversity. That's what we want to have. We want to be able to persist in the face of challenges and bounce back from adversity. You know, what more do you want out of life, right? And in building resilience, the study of public defenders, I just mentioned earlier, the Wisconsin Public Defenders study, certainly something that I encourage you to read. And one of the things that I like to remind people about resilience is that resilience is a set of skills. And like every skill, no matter what area of your life, if it's a skill, it can be learned, taught, and improved. No matter what the skill is, learned, taught, and improved. So if you feel that you're not as good at cross-examining a witness, that's a skill. You can work on it and improve it. If you want to improve your resilience, it's a set of skills. You can work on it and improve it. And the ability to persevere in the face of adversity and in difficulty and to bounce back from adversity feeds into our ability to maintain competence as lawyers. And that connection is unbreakable. So there's a brief protocol that we oftentimes talk about for debriefing a stressful situation. Take some deep cleansing breaths, and I'm aware that we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm wrapping up, I promise. Take a few deep breaths to help calm you, and ask yourself, what is the stressor? What's causing the stress? What's the stressor here? And then ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could possibly happen? Lawyers are really good at this question because we love catastrophizing, and we're very good at identifying everything that could possibly go wrong. So once we've identified what the worst thing that could happen is, then we've got, we identified that, and it can't be worse than that, right? Then we can ask ourselves, well, what must I do to allow that to happen? And it's usually either some action or some inaction on your part that will allow or increase the likelihood of the worst possible thing happening. That thing that you must do, that action or the inaction, that's in your control. So already we've started to look at how you can control this stressful situation. We've already identified the things that you can do or must refrain from doing in order to allow the worst thing to happen. And then you can ask, well, what's on the other end of the spectrum? What's the very best thing that could happen? And what is my preferred outcome? I like that better, is what's my preferred outcome? And what can I do to increase the likelihood of my preferred outcome happening? And we've identified more things that are within my control. And really, once we wrest control back from whatever the stressor is, our stress level and our anxiety level begins to fall. Oftentimes we talk about the six pillars of well-being. As you can see them here, occupational and intellectual tend to be the money ones for lawyers. We like to remind people that all of these things don't happen in a vacuum. There's a cultural overlay to everything that colors how we look at everything. It matters whether you were born and raised in Minnesota or born and raised in Mexico City. There's a cultural difference there. Or born and raised in Toronto, Canada. There's a cultural difference between Canada and Minnesota. And those things are important. I do work for LCL. LCL is Minnesota's Lawyer Assistance Program. We help lawyers, judges, law students, staff, and their immediate family members with any issue that's preventing them from doing their best work. That's it. It's any issue. You got issues that's preventing you from doing your best work, we can help. Our communications are strictly confidential. We work with the Sand Creek Group, Sand Creek EAP. We offer 4 free counseling sessions on any issue per client per year. They have a resource site. You can set up an account. They have a myriad of thousands of resource materials on a myriad of subjects. You can contact them directly. If you need to contact LCL, here's our contact information. In closing, I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and let you know that if you have an issue that you think is going to go away by itself, probably won't. Call us. We can help, and we will help. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for that informative presentation, and just for putting so simply and in a way we can all understand something I'm sure we all have experienced. I know I have, and it's just great to have that reminder that we're not alone. Even if we are working alone at home in an office, we're all in this together. So great to see you all. We are at time here. This recording will be available on the Minnesota statewide Facebook page, as well as the PAD member page. And I've shared the CLE code with you all. Thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.